They had the same rustic charm and were identical jokers. On Hee Haw, the twins, John and Jim Hager, made millions of people giggle. They became well known thanks to their similar harmonies and smiles. Two very different guys, each with their own secret anguish, lived behind the synchronized laughter and crisp picture. They had a platform thanks to fame, but it came with costs. When the camera stopped rolling, what actually happened? In the background of the show that made them famous, how did their lives develop? And what hasn't been made public yet, because nobody anticipated the truth regarding the Hager twins last year's. Nashville is not where they were born. Hollywood is not where they were born. They were not even related by birth. However, a Methodist preacher and his wife adopted Jim and John Hager, identical twins born in Chicago on August 30, 1941, and brought them up in the Midwest. The twins were inseparable while growing up in Park Ridge, Illinois. In fact, they were so similar that it was difficult for even their professors to distinguish between them. However, their appearance was not the only thing they matched. It was their love of music, their comedy, their rhythm, and their remarkable ability to complete each other's words. They were performing at school events, singing in church choruses, and playing the guitar at night when they were barely 11 years old. They would mimic the Everly Brothers' harmonies and aspire to perform live someday. They would eventually follow that goal all the way to California's West Coast, where the twins enrolled in a performing arts institution. There, they worked odd jobs to make ends meet, while landing modest roles in local theatrical shows. However, it was not an audition that led to their success. It resulted from an accidental encounter. The twins attracted the attention of Buck Owens's team one evening while performing at a small bar in Los Angeles. A rising star in country music at the time, Owens recognized something in the brothers, a genuine, unadulterated charm that was impossible to fake. He drew them into his circle. Before long, the Hager twins were performing with Buck as support vocalists and guitarists. Being in the background didn't bother them. All they wanted was to be in the room. However, it wouldn't be long before they took center stage. In order to compete with the sleek urban appeal of Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, CBS approved a new variety show in 1969 that featured a quirky comedic hour with a country theme. Hee Haw would be that show. Owens was chosen to co-host the show. Buck also had a suggestion for producers, who wanted to add new, fresh-faced country talent to complete the group. Obtain the twins of Hager. They would become instantly famous as a result of that move. The twins immediately won over viewers with their matching costumes and distinctive blonde bangs. They were more than just performers. They performed as actors, comedians, and entertainers. They brought an indisputable synergy that no other pair could match. And their timing was spot on and their quips were hilarious. America fell in love. The thousands of fan letters came flooding in. Women loved them. Children imitated them. They became into the hay bales heartthrobs. However, the amusing thing about fame is that, although the world watched two happy singing brothers on Saturday night TV, very few people were aware of what was actually happening behind the scenes. John and Jim were getting up quickly, but not equally. And the other twin started to subtly withdraw, while one twin welcomed the limelight. The audience was unaware that this ideal pair was already beginning to drift apart. Jim and John Hager were naturals, from the first time they set foot on the Hee Haw set. Even at the height of their stardom, the twins made everything seem easy. Whether they were singing poignant ballads in between giggles, or delivering punchlines in the cornfield skits. However, the reality was far more complex than what people witnessed on film. Behind the scenes, Jim in particular was suffering from the pressure to be the happy, spotless team that America adored. He was more reserved, more reflective, and more aware of the pressures of celebrity. Jim frequently withdrew after filming, opting for quiet over celebration, whereas John appeared to flourish under the spotlight. Although the twins had always done everything together, they were suddenly starting to react differently to celebrity. The show's demands were unrelenting. Schedules for taping were lengthy. The creators didn't want anything too realistic, and the humor needed to be witty but appropriate for a family. Despite being brilliant musicians and songwriters in their own right, the Hagers were rarely given the opportunity to perform their own songs. They were confined to a formula instead: sing, laugh, and repeat. The twins gradually began to resist. They desired more creativity, more involvement, and more room to develop. However, the fight began to wear them down, because the Hee Haw machine was not readily swayed. Off-camera, John looked to Los Angeles and Nashville's nightlife for distraction. Insiders began to identify him as the more gregarious twin, the one who dated celebrities, went out to clubs, and sought out novel experiences. He was endearing, witty, and always had a joke ready. Jim, however, became increasingly reclusive. He looked inward. According to some, he battled depression even before it was a recognized condition. Others spoke of private struggles with prescription drugs that took place long before they made national news. Neither brother ever discussed these difficulties in public. They may have been too afraid of what would happen if the reality were revealed, but they were also too proud and devoted to the image. However, their loved ones took note. On certain days, Jim would arrive on set emotionally spent, but as soon as the camera started rolling, he would return to his normal self. Rumors circulated that the brothers were at odds with one another. Being only half of an image wasn't easy, and despite the fact that their act was based on being the same, they were changing drastically. Offstage, their differences were drawing them into divergent orbits, despite the public's admiration for their sameness. And one of the Hager twins was slowly but surely starting to come apart, while the rest of the world laughed with them. The next chapter would demonstrate how far the spotlight and the soul would drift apart, and the gap between them was only getting greater. When Hee Haw formally completed its syndicated run in 1993, the laughter stopped. It signaled the end of an era for the Hager twins as well as for country television. The brothers have been a common sight in American living rooms for about 25 years. They continued to provide harmony, laughter, and a timeless homegrown charm each week. However, the constant routine of their life ended when the cameras ceased recording. Everything altered without the show's structure. Reservations slowed down. The once warm limelight started to dim off, and the fan mail dwindled. Initially, Jim and John made an effort to continue. They performed at minor country music festivals, charity events, and state fairs. They even collaborated to record a gospel album, something they had always desired. The crowds, however, differed. There was a change in energy, and they were no longer a sure thing without the Hee Haw machine behind them. They were very aware that the fame they had once had was evaporating. The decrease was frustrating to John. He had always aspired to pursue other artistic endeavors, such as acting in motion pictures or penning meaningful music. He experimented with solo projects, tried pitching ideas to networks, and even looked for potential in Christian television. However, doors that used to open on their own now remained closed. It was even more difficult for Jim. He was alone with ideas he had suppressed for years, without the continual distraction of filmmaking, touring, and rehearsals. He started to withdraw more and more. He rarely answered calls, according to friends. He stopped attending social events. His eyes seemed to lose the radiance that his admirers had adored. And even though he continued to occasionally perform with John, it was obvious that he was no longer really there. Their once easy twin dynamic felt strained now. They remained greatest friends and brothers. However, there was a silent melancholy between them that had never existed before. They seldom ever discussed it in public. The Hagers disliked displaying armor cracks. However, those closest to them witnessed it. The conundrum that plagues so many performers, the anguish of being irrelevant, and the uncertainty of identity. When no one is looking, who am I? They made modest attempts to obtain solutions. Jim started going to retreats for spiritual purposes. John spent time serving and delving further into his faith. However, recovery was challenging. The past was very much present. The quiet was deafening. The Hager twins were also uncertain about what would happen next for the first time in their lives. They had everything because of fame. However, it had now discreetly abandoned them, and the challenges they faced in the upcoming years would put their relationship to the ultimate test. For many years, the Hager twins were portrayed as charming bachelors who were always smiling, flirting, and just out of reach. Fans all around the nation admired them as Hee Haw's heartthrobs because of their neat appearances and matching clothes. However, beneath the stage presence and coordinated smiles were two individuals with quite distinct romantic histories. The more gregarious of the two, John Hager, had a series of high-profile relationships that sparked rumors in Music City but never made headlines. A well-known country singer, possibly even a fellow Hee Haw cast member, was the subject of one lengthy reported affair. Several sources mentioned their closeness off-camera, the late-night phone calls, and the meticulously concealed weekends away, even though John never publicly acknowledged it. However, it ended gently, leaving more memories than regrets. As is often the case with romances in the profession, he had sporadic relationships for years, occasionally gravely, occasionally lightheartedly, but always with caution. According to friends, John never really let his guard down. Not completely. Despite its size, his heart was limited. He didn't seek dedication. He sought friendship. It was an inconspicuous, never-ending quest for connection. Jim Hager, however, was not like that. Although he had fewer interactions, he felt them more intensely, and one in particular had a profound impact. Jim fell in love with a woman he met at a Tennessee charity event in the late 1980s. She was not well known. She didn't work in the field. But she was everything to Jim. Those who knew him saw something uncommon for the first time. There was an open, carefree, even happy side to Jim. He talked about getting married, making a fresh start, and creating a more peaceful life with her away from the demands of TV. However, that dream would never materialize. She died suddenly. Some attribute it to illness, while others point to a vehicle collision. The specifics were never disclosed in full. Jim ceased discussing it. However, something within of him permanently closed after she passed away. He never again pursued marriage or a meaningful relationship. He never made an effort to replace what he had lost. He felt as though she had been buried with a piece of his soul. The truth was much more precarious. Even if the public still perceived Jim and John as carefree bachelors, heartbreak and distance, rather than love and play, characterized their romantic lives. They had discovered early on that living in a space designed for two made love difficult. Their stardom also made genuine partnerships all but impossible, traveling, performing, and being watched all the time. Thus they leaned on one another for protection. Always put your brothers first. It turned to become a source of solace, stability, and support. However, even that was insufficient to cover the voids caused by lost love. The loneliness only grew more intense as the years passed. The pain persisted even when the women came and went, and that gap could never be filled by a camera, applause, or Saturday night giggles. There was no romance in the next chapter. The time has come for reckoning. The understanding that time was running out came slowly and painfully. It would also run out too soon for one brother. The Hager twins had moved far away from the dazzling lights of Hee Haw by the middle of the 2000s. They continued to perform occasionally, primarily at nostalgia performances for devoted fans, small-town festivals, and state fairs. However, time had worn it down. Their blonde hair, which matched, had become gray. The energy that made them famous had started to fade, and the crowds had gotten smaller. In particular, Jim Hager was looking worn. Long pauses, erratic moods, and a fatigue that went beyond aging had taken the place of his formerly lively personality. When asked, he was still quick to crack a joke, and when the curtain came up, he remained professional. Those closest to him, however, noticed the flaws. They whispered about his drugs, his loneliness, and the sadness he had been fighting in private for years. Jim appeared to be trapped, in contrast to John, who found little meaning in spiritual practice and the occasional song. He stopped discussing the future. He hardly spoke of the past. He just was. Though they had always been close, the brothers' relationship had changed. John began doing interviews on their behalf. Jim would grin, nod, and perhaps say something. But the spark that had made him half of one of the most popular country television duos was quickly vanishing. But the light died out on May 2008. Jim Hager's body was discovered in his apartment in Nashville. He was 66, and suspected heart attack was the cause. However, his heart wasn't the only thing that had failed, according to those closest to him. It was all of it. The loneliness, the growing health problems, the years of quiet suffering, and the challenge of living in the shadow of his former self. John was heartbroken. For more than 60 years, they had been united through joy, sorrow, failure, and fame. John Hager was now forced to face the world by himself for the first time in his life. In the days after Jim's passing, he remained silent. He didn't say anything. There was no press conference. He just disappeared. Friends claimed that he was distraught and that he silently strolled around their shared house, unable to sleep in the same room where they had practiced. Jim left the instruments in their current location. Nothing happened to the stage costumes. It was more than just grief for John. It was confusion. It was more than a sibling he had lost. He had lost his second half, his balance, and his mirror. John once joked in interviews years ago that the most difficult thing about having a twin was, you never know who you'd be without the other guy. He eventually learned the truth after Jim passed away, and he was hardly able to live with that fact. There was no second act that ensued. It unraveled gradually. Oh, the silent grief of life. With the unexpected death of a twin and the dilemma of whether one's soul could ever fully exist without the other, it would finish just as tragically as it had started. Something inside John Hager just ceased functioning after Jim Hager's untimely death in 2008. They were referred to as the Hager twins by everyone, a pair that is packaged, Two cowboy boot pairs that match, two voices, two smiles. Now, however, John had to live as one for the first time in 66 years. Only John. And that burden was too much to bear. In the days after Jim's burial, friends attempted to contact John, but he refused to answer his phone. He no longer laughed as freely as he used to. His movements slowed, his voice got soft, and his face grew haggard. He turned down offers, interviews, appearances, tributes, nostalgia shows, and even a reunion with Hee Haw. He rejected each one. In private, John maintained everything the same, but when asked why, he would simply respond, "I don't know how to be half of anything." Jim's guitar, unaltered, was still in its stand. They still had their identical stage costumes hanging in the closet, immaculately ironed. Jim even left his half of the breakfast table arranged every morning, as though his brother may suddenly enter and make a joke about being late. However, he never did. Outgoing, resilient, and more willing to face life's volatility. John had always been the stronger of the two, but he had no motivation to fight now that Jim was gone. Everything had been shared between them. They shared hotel rooms, heartbreaks, birthdays, songs, and even their quiet moments. John now had to deal with an unfamiliar, strange silence. He strayed from the present to the past. He would play old tapes of their Hee Haw performances, smile subtly at Jim's timing, and then look at the television blankly when it was over. He seldom ever replied to letters of encouragement from supporters. It wasn't impolite, it was void. John didn't die when Jim died, but something vital inside him did, a close friend subsequently stated. Though he was never given a terminal diagnosis, John's health started to deteriorate quickly. Within months of Jim's death, for reasons that the doctors were unable to explain, his vitals were stable, but he appeared worn out and exhausted, as if he had already said goodbye and was just waiting for the curtain to fall. The grief had become ingrained in his bones. Less than a year after Jim's death, on January 9, 2009, John Hager, then 67, passed away in his sleep at their Nashville home. There was no medical emergency or warning, just a sudden disappearance. Some people blamed it on poetic timing, while others thought it was a broken heart. However, those closest to the Hager twins thought it was something more straightforward. To the majority of viewers, the Hager twins were just cute clowns in country costumes, who were always smiling and laughing. John simply couldn't live without his brother. They had been mirror images in life and were reunited in death. Perhaps it was only fitting that two boys who had entered the world together end up together. Offset, Jim, and John were more than just actors. They were artists, songwriters, and men who longed to be taken seriously. Over the years, they presented Hee Haw producers with ideas for original songs, heartfelt sketches, and even dramatic moments. However, there was another side of their story that the cameras never caught. The twins continued to perform the same parts, while their creative hopes subtly waned, because the show wanted laughs, not layers. Jim in particular became more reclusive. Others noticed changes in his energy, timing, and refusal to push back. John, always protective, started speaking for both of them in meetings. And at home, their lives were simpler, but still focused on each other. In one private clip, Jim forgets a chord and laughs, saying, "Let's just fake it like we always do." John also laughs, a line that is meant to be humorous but is full of truth because, despite their fame, a large portion of their lives had been spent maintaining appearances. Up until now, the real story, the pressure, the disappointments, the emotional weight had never been included in the script. Perhaps that was their intention. For decades, the Hager twins delighted America with a synchronized act that seemed natural. The story of Jim and John Hager is not just about comedy or music, or even about fame. It is about what happens when two lives are so entwined that the world only sees them as one. They were not perfect stars. They were men who yearned for authenticity, in a field that relies heavily on illusion, who lived in silence through heartbreak, frustration, and the slow ache of waning relevance. Two voices, two hearts, one rhythm. But when the laughter subsided, something much more human was left behind. They never betrayed one another. And ultimately, their greatest success was loyalty, the kind of loyalty that endures loss. The kind that keeps you going when you're the only one left, and the kind that doesn't falter when the spotlight goes away. The Hager twins entered this world side by side and left it nearly in the same way. Their story, which is frequently ignored in the history of country music, is more than just a footnote. John once said that being a twin meant never having to explain yourself. Jim already knew. Perhaps that's why John followed Jim just months later, when Jim passed away. They were two guys sharing one life, and perhaps, Just perhaps, that's the kind of legacy that no spotlight could ever adequately convey. It's a silent masterpiece of brotherhood, loyalty, and unsaid strength.